Censorship is on the rise worldwide right now, so it's vital to be able to maintain communications with your family and friends no matter what. Signal is one of the most popular encrypted messengers out there, and it's one of our top recommendations at Privacy Guides. So in this video, we're going to talk about what you can do to keep it running reliably even in a censored area. Signal is one of our favorite messengers, but it's not perfect. One drawback of Signal is that it's centralized. Centralization does have upsides, like being able to ensure that everyone is using the latest version that has the most recent security fixes. But one of the disadvantages is that it's pretty easy to censor if a government or service provider wanted to. Now, one solution here is to use one of the other messengers we recommend, and that's not a bad idea. SimpleX and Briar both do have built-in censorship-resistant features, but there's a lot of reasons that you may not want to opt for this solution. For example, Briar is Android only, and SimpleX has a smaller user base than Signal. Thankfully, there is a solution that doesn't require you to get all your friends and family to switch if you've already convinced them all to get on Signal, and that's to run a Signal Proxy. When you go to a website and you see HTTPS in the address bar, the S stands for secure. These days, websites use Transport Layer Security, or TLS, to enable that. Signal proxies are officially called Signal TLS proxies because they use the same traffic pattern, making them blend in with all the other traffic and thus harder for governments to block without simply blocking the entire internet, which admittedly is something that some governments have been known to do in extreme circumstances, but that's a topic for another video. A Signal proxy is exactly what the name implies. It simply proxies traffic to and from Signal servers by way of a middleman. Signal's web addresses might be blocked, but volunteer-run proxies are much harder to find and censor. A government would have to find and block each one, a potentially massive game of whack-a-mole. All traffic to and from a Signal proxy is only Signal traffic. All non-Signal traffic gets rejected, and it's all end-to-end encrypted, so there's no risk to the volunteer or the user in running or using one. Anyone can run a Signal proxy. That means if you're living in a country with censored internet, you can set one up to help ensure stable, secure communication with your own friends and family, both inside and outside of the country. But that also means that if you're living in an uncensored country, you can set one up and offer it to people in censored countries for use. The steps are the same, so whichever scenario you find yourself in, this video is for you. In this video, we're going to be hosting our proxy on a virtual private server, or VPS, which is a server that we rent from a commercial provider. In a future video, we'll talk more about the pros and cons of hosting at home versus a VPS, but here's our main reasons for using a VPS in this video. 1. When you host a publicly accessible service at home, you risk exposing your IP address if you're not careful, which can reveal your location. A VPS is hosted in a data center somewhere, so that's not a concern. 2. Many internet service providers rotate residential IP addresses regularly, so setting up a server hosted in your home requires additional steps to ensure consistent, stable service. VPSs don't have this problem. 3. If you live somewhere without reliable power or with frequent internet outages, like my last apartment, that will affect your service's reliability. Most VPS providers have a near 100% uptime guarantee. 4. Anytime you have a device at home that's connected to the wider internet, you're opening the door for attackers to find some kind of weakness they can exploit to gain access to your home network. While there are ways to mitigate this risk, a VPS basically makes this a non-issue. There are a lot of good VPS providers to choose from. For example, Linode, Hetzner, Scaleway, DigitalOcean, and Vulture. There are even some that are specifically focused on privacy, like Najala or 1984. I've decided to go with Hetzner because I think they have pretty decent prices, but for the record, Privacy Guides does not endorse any specific hosting provider at this time. Feel free to leave suggestions in the comments on who you would use and why you'd recommend them. One thing to factor in is that depending on the situation, certain major providers, like the ones we've listed, might be censored completely in the country that you're trying to help. That's not really something we can address in this video because it would be a case-by-case basis, but just keep that in mind when you're picking a provider. Now, most providers offer several choices of VPS with varying degrees of performance. It should be safe to go with the cheapest, lowest powered option because honestly, a Signal proxy shouldn't really require a lot of overhead. It's just sending messages. It's not rendering video or storing databases or anything crazy like that. For operating system, I typically use Ubuntu. We don't recommend Ubuntu for your personal devices like laptops, but Ubuntu is one of the most popular server operating systems, so it's the one that's easiest to work with. Now, before we start configuring our VPS, let's buy a domain name. Once again, there are a lot of good domain registrars to choose from. Some well-regarded ones include Porkbun, Namecheap, or Hover. There are also privacy-focused ones, again like Najala, although there are some drawbacks to the more privacy-protecting ones. We recommend searching our forum at discuss.privacyguides.net to learn more and hear from the first-hand experiences of other community members. I personally use Namecheap because they are, as the name suggests, cheap. But once more, Privacy Guides does not endorse any specific provider. I happen to have a few domains lying around, so I'm going to use the new oil.xyz domain that I'm basically not really using anymore. You can use any domain you want or buy a new one if you don't already have one. Make sure when you buy the domain to enable domain privacy protection, which will keep your real name and email address from being public. Some providers like Namecheap offer this for free, others might call it by another name like WhoisGuard or something like that. Trust me, you want this, at very least, because if you don't get it, you'll get constantly spammed from people offering to build your website or your app or SEO boost or whatever. It's awful. I made that mistake once and never again. If you do take our advice and use different registrars and hosting providers, make sure you go into your registrar's DNS records and point your domain at the IP address of the VPS. How to do this will depend on where you got the domain, but typically you will find a section to edit your DNS records that looks like this, and that allows you to enter a name, record type, and IP address. Check your registrar's documentation if you run into any issues, but in my experience, it's usually pretty intuitive. Make sure that the record type is set to A and that the address is the same as your VPS. For the name, we're going to enter Signal, which will make your Signal proxy run on a subdomain. So in this case, it would be signal.thenewoil.xyz. You can use a different name to make the subdomain whatever you'd like, but we strongly recommend using a subdomain instead of nothing at all. This gives you more flexibility in the future in case you want to use that domain to host something else. Okay, now we're ready to connect and start setting up. The first time you connect, there's an important change that you should make to your server to make it more secure, but I don't want to make things too confusing by adding in additional steps right now, so stay tuned until the end of the video and I'll cover that and much more. If you've never installed Linux before, I recommend starting by running updates. Kind of like buying a new computer, usually the pre-installed version is just slightly out of date and a quick update will bring it up to speed. So in Ubuntu, you do this by running apt update and apt upgrade y.
A few moments later.
We're also going to go ahead and make sure that we've got some tools we'll need later by running apt install git sudo ufw-y. And it looks like we've already got those, so we're good to go. Now we're ready to start installing the proxy itself. The official instructions to install a Signal TLS proxy are found on GitHub, and we'll link to that in the comments. Always be sure to check the official documentation for the latest instructions. Okay, so step 1 is to install Docker. Thankfully, Signal makes this really easy for us by linking directly to the right version that we will need. So just follow the instructions for your operating system, which in this case is Ubuntu. Since this is a fresh server, we don't have any old versions to uninstall, and I'm going to use the apt method so that it will be easier to keep it updated later in the future. Now, real quick, I do want to issue a warning against just copy and pasting commands you find online if you're not sure what they do. In this case, it's probably safe because this came from a trusted source, which was the official Docker documentation, which in turn we got from the official Signal GitHub page. And we also have the advantage of having some comments here that tell us what each of these commands are doing. Still, if you're ever unsure, it's always a good idea to err on the side of caution and look up what the command does. Okay, so now that we've installed Docker and it seems to be working, step 2 is to clone the repository. And we can do that with git clone and then the link to the GitHub repository here. Once it's done downloading, we can just enter the directory by using change directory, which is cd. So the command becomes cd signal-tls-proxy. This is basically the command line version of opening a folder. Now, once we're in the directory, step 3 is to run this init certificate sh. And this is a script that runs all the necessary steps for us. The only thing you really need to do is enter your domain name from earlier. So in my case, it's signal.thenewoil.xyz. And it's going to handle all of the install and setup for us, including the Signal proxy and everything. So real quick, while that's running, if you're finding this tutorial helpful, we'd really appreciate it if you gave Privacy Guides some support. Privacy Guides is an impartial, volunteer-run nonprofit, and our mission is to bring people the best digital privacy and consumer technology rights advice on the internet. We want to make a lot more tutorials like this one, but we can't do that without your help. You can make a donation by going to privacyguides.org/donate, or you can buy some merch at shop.privacyguides.org. Every little bit really helps us out. Okay, it looks like everything went smooth. It says certificate successfully received, everything's extracted. So the last step is to run this Docker setting, or this Docker command, docker compose up, detach, and just like that. And it's gonna do its thing here. Boom, and that's it. You're good to start sharing your Signal proxy. The address will be signal.tube/#yourproxyname. So in my case, it becomes signal.tube/#signal.thenewOil.xyz. That feels really weird to say out loud, but you can see it on the screen now. You can feel free to try to connect to that one if you want, but just know that I have no intention of keeping this up long term, so if you're watching this video later, it probably won't work. Earlier I mentioned that when first setting up the VPS, there's a critical step to make your server more secure. There's actually a few things, so let's talk about those now. For one, you can use the uncomplicated firewall to block unused ports, and that's the UFW we installed earlier. A Signal proxy only requires ports 80 and 443 to be open for it to function, but you should also leave 22 open so that you can connect to it remotely. You can do all this with the commands that are on screen right now. You can also enable remote access using SSH key pairs and disable password login for added security. This is really easy to do, but it's a lot of steps. So instead, we're going to leave a link to a high-quality tutorial from DigitalOcean that should guide you through the process. You can do this from Mac or Windows, but it's a lot easier on Linux in my experience. So if you have access to your own Linux machine, I highly recommend using that. Last but not least, enable unattended upgrades so that your server will automatically get security fixes even when you're not around. I would still check in about once a week to ensure that there are other less critical upgrades that aren't getting ignored. Again, we plan to make a more in-depth video about self-hosting in the future, and when we do that, we'll talk about all of this stuff in more detail, as well as lots of other stuff like alternatives such as IP tables. And that's it. You should now have a reliable, reasonably secure Signal proxy running for you, your friends, or anyone else who needs one. If you're setting this up for other people, be sure not to share the address publicly, since that will make it easier for your proxy to be found and added to a block list. Instead, the Signal people recommend using the hashtag Signal Proxy to tell people that you have one, and to have them DM you or use some other more private way to share the link with them directly. Thank you for watching, and if you're not using an encrypted messenger yet, check out this video that explains why you might want to start.